Buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to a new webinar from the Bankinter Innovation Foundation. I am Ruth Bosque, and today we are going to reflect on a very important topic. What's real and what's made up about AI? To explore this question, we are joined by a very special guest, Jeremy Kahn, AI editor at Fortune magazine, and author of the book Mastering AI. We are also lucky to have another wonderful guest with us today, our collaborator and friend Frances Seller, senior journalist at the Washington Post and regular facilitator of our think tanks. Frances is running today's webinar, so I'll give the floor to her. And Jeremy, I'm really looking forward to this talk. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Jeremy. Welcome, Frances. Thank you. And one last thing, at the end of the talk, we'll save a few minutes for your questions. So you can send them using the Q&A box. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks.
Ruth. Thank you also to the Bankinter Foundation for hosting this and for your regular focus on emerging technologies and their impact in Spain and in Europe more broadly. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Jeremy to this webinar today. He is, as Ruth said, an expert on AI for Fortune magazine, where he writes the Eye on AI newsletter. He is also, as Ruth said, the author of Mastering AI, a survival guide to our superpowered future. Jeremy, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Frances, and thank you, Ruth, and thank you to the foundation as well for having me here. I've written this book, which you can sort of see behind me on my shelf, but I can hold it up. That's Mastering AI, a survival guide to our superpowered future. Which is out in the US from Simon & Schuster and Bedford Square in the UK.
So, Jeremy, that subtitle, of course, grabbed me right away. Anything that says survival guide gives me a little bit of pause. Tell me what prompted you? What was the urgency? What prompted you to write it?
Yeah, so I started writing this book shortly after OpenAI debuted ChatGPT. I'd been covering AI at that point for about 8 years, actually. I'd covered AI starting as a technology reporter at Bloomberg and continued to do so in my current role at Fortune. And it was just very obvious after ChatGPT came out that everybody was talking about AI, and I knew quite a lot about the subject, having covered it for so long. And so many people had so many questions about what this technology would mean for our jobs, for the economy, for society, and for our futures. And I felt like I had some insight into that. I certainly had access to all of the AI researchers at a lot of these top labs, so I could talk to them about where they thought the technology was going. I could explain a little bit to people about how this technology has come about, where did the innovations that ultimately led to ChatGPT come from, and to give people a kind of primer for thinking through both, what I think some of the opportunities are, but also what are some of the very real risks that we face with this technology. And so that's why I decided to call it a survival guide, because I think there are risks here. And I was, hoping, I hope in the book that I've given people some ideas about how we might, govern this technology, how we might think about using it, how we should think about designing it and deploying it, so that we can sort of sidestep what I think are some of those really big risks that are incumbent upon the technology, and hopefully seize what I think are really great opportunities that the technology also allows. And I think on balance, I'm an optimist. I think this is going to be a really impactful technology with some really great impacts for us. But in order to make sure that that's the case and that the balance is more on the positive side than not, I do think there are steps we need to take urgently to sort of sidestep a lot of those dangers.
So let's talk a little bit about what's happened. The book published, I think, a year ago, and it predicted massive disruption across industries in the next 5 years, including increased efficiency and some of the other benefits you're talking about. What did you get right a year ago? What's changed? What surprised you in the year since it came out?
Yeah, so the book's not quite a year out, but almost a year, and I think I got a lot of the big trends right, both in sort of the positive and negative impacts. And I mean, I think unfortunately, some of the negative impacts that I predicted that we're going to start to see in terms of, in particular, people sort of losing a sense of reality when talking to chatbots. We were already starting to see evidence that that's happening. There have been a number of unfortunate cases, and there was a very interesting story actually just ran last week in the New York Times about people who really, through talking to chatbots, became convinced of conspiracy theories and kind of went down these rabbit holes, which one could have done before, just exploring links on the internet. But there's something about the way a chatbot presents information that's so much more convincing, and that story was rather harrowing. It had a number of people who, were otherwise quite considered themselves quite sane, had no history of mental illness, but for whatever reason were sort of vulnerable to exploring these rather bizarre ideas and became very convinced of them through their conversations with these chatbots and really started to develop kind of delusions and paranoia through that experience. So I think that's something we really need to watch out for. So that was like one of the trends that I identified in the book that has certainly starting to come to pass. I also guess, I mean, I do think this is going to be incredibly impactful on work, on productivity, on efficiency, and we are seeing very rapid adoption of this technology in business. With, I'd say, the productivity gains so far are rather uneven. Some businesses are claiming, really big leaps in productivity and efficiency, and you are starting to see, particularly in software development, a lot of companies saying, we're just not going to hire as many software developers. We don't need to for the same level of business as we did in the past. On the other hand, I think some of the use cases people are still struggling to figure out, does this really produce any meaningful productivity gain? Certainly some of it's very hard to measure. I've heard a lot of businesses complain that, yes, we're deploying AI in all these areas, but we can't quite figure out what the return on that investment is. And it can be a somewhat expensive technology to use. We're also starting to see a lot of attention to the environmental impacts of the technology. So we're talking about building these absolutely massive data centers all over the world. There was just a number of deals done after Trump came into office for this thing called Project Stargate, which OpenAI is collaborating with SoftBank and Oracle and others on, and which they've now taken some money from a number of Gulf states to help fund. And that, these are massive energy data centers that would take gigawatts of electricity, enough electricity that would otherwise be used to power, the equivalent of a decent sized city. I think that's raising a lot of concerns, rightfully, about, what is the energy impact of this technology? And that's another area that I certainly identified in the book. Yeah, I'd say in general, the trends I got pretty much right. Now, there are some specific things that have happened that since the book came out that were hard to predict. I think one of the things we've seen is, for instance, the evolution of these what are called reasoning models. These are models that use a kind of step-by-step thinking process or what appears to be a step-by-step thinking process. I should be careful about how we characterize this, but to arrive at their answers. So they seem to be taking these steps. That's something I didn't really predict, would happen, and that has somewhat changed how people think about using this technology, what it's capable of potentially in the nearer term. I think, did not predict the extent to which the companies from China would really catch up in the capabilities of companies that in the U.S. and Europe are developing this technology, primarily in the U.S. And that's also changed things. Yeah.
There's a question that comes up all the time when I'm talking to people, and it came up yesterday when I was talking to a young journalist. And that's one of the great ironies of this technology is that software developers seem to be not as needed as one would have thought 5 or 10 years ago. It's taking away their jobs. But what jobs do you think are actually secure? Where is the human touch needed going ahead? Do you identify any?
Oh, I mean, I think there are lots. But they tend not to be in the area, like it's very hard actually in a lot of these areas of what's called knowledge work to think about what areas are necessarily going to be safe. However, I think anything that involves actual sort of human contact, physical contact, is probably much safer. And some of the things that are knowledge work that also do involve a large degree of human touch, I think are pretty safe. So if you look at healthcare, I think doctors and nurses are still very much going to be needed. It may be the case that doctors are using AI to help them, read medical scans. They might be using it to provide some advice on what the diagnosis might be. They may have the AI help develop treatment plans. It may do a lot of the administrative work in terms of actually writing letters to insurers and that sort of thing, potentially even explaining to the patient what their diagnosis is and why a certain treatment's important. So there's lots of ways I think AI is going to assist doctors and nurses, but I think we're still going to need doctors and nurses. And so much of that profession is still actually about laying hands on a patient and providing that very human emotional contact, and I don't think that's going away anytime soon. So I think those are safe. I think a lot of professions in sort of social care, elder care are safe. I think we'll still very much need human teachers. So I think all the teaching professions are safe, although again, I think how you teach is going to change dramatically with the use of AI assistants and the fact that all the students potentially will have access to kind of AI tutors that can provide very personalized educational advice to them. But I see this more as something that's going to really augment human teachers, not replace them. And I think that even if you look at the law, yes, a lot of legal work I think is potentially going to be impacted by this technology, but I think it's still going to be a long time before we have robot lawyers in court. So I think if you were still going to need lawyers to actually go and appear in court and argue before a judge, and I don't see that changing certainly anytime in the next 5 years. And I think there's lots of professions that involve some amount of physical work that aren't going to be affected particularly by this technology. But I think if you sit in an office all day, and if I was talking to someone the other day, and I think this is a good point. If your job title has the word analyst in it, you are or could if you could think of a way of writing your job description where essentially what you do is analyze written information. Yes, I think you have to worry about what the impact of this technology is going to be in the next 5 years.
You and I sat in a meeting 6 months ago watching people bring out little robots that were designed to go into older people's houses to keep them company, to give feedback. That's in the elder care area you were talking about. And I was sort of amazed by the reports some people had of this little robotic creature, embodied AI, in fact, giving them support and feedback that they felt they needed. I'm also hesitant that I would want that sort of companionship in my life. But I guess we're all learning to live with robots or embodied AI in a way we never thought we would have had to.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting that the conference that the foundation put on back in November, which was all about embodied AI, and embodied AI is an area where we're seeing really fast advancements, and I guess that's an area where some of that I don't address as much in the book, but it has been interesting to watch what's happened in the past year as robotics seems to be making big leaps forward, in part because of these large language models. They can be used as a kind of natural language interface to the robot. So it becomes much easier to tell a robot what you want it to do. You can literally just talk to it as you would a person and give it instructions, which was never really the case before. And at the same time, a lot of AI scientists who work on embodied AI have been building what are called world models. So these are models that have quite a lot of understanding about the world, and foundation models specifically for robots. So like there's a group out of California, a startup called Physical Intelligence, that built one of these. And the idea is it can take any of these kind of one-armed robots that are used for a lot of tasks in warehouses and fulfillment centers, and it can pick up different kinds of objects. It doesn't have to be programmed specifically for every type of object you might have, and it can sort out all of these different things. And it also, this AI software can be transferred between these robot arms made by different manufacturers, because that was another problem before. You couldn't really do that. Every different make and model of robot arm would need its own software, and that software would have to be, millions of lines of code, and it was very difficult to get robots to work. Suddenly they're working. Now that said, I still think, yes, it is true that we were at that conference, there was a presentation about some of these elder care robots, but I think it's important to think about what those are doing. First, and mostly it's about sort of checking in on an elderly relative, giving them someone to talk to so they're a little bit less lonely perhaps, but also maybe reminding them to take medication, helping them with some tasks so they can be maybe a little bit more independent. But I think if it's somebody who actually needs physical assistance in their house, whether that's getting to the bathroom or getting out of the house to do their shopping, that this robot's not going to help them. So you're still going to need a person to do a lot of those skills. I don't think I would again see that kind of elder care assistant robot
Right.
as a complement to a human, social
Right.
worker, social care worker, as opposed to a replacement for them. And then I do think there's an ethical issue with a robot like that, which I remember bringing up at the conference, which is I do really worry that the advent of little robots like that perhaps becomes a crutch, and I wonder if people will think, oh, I don't have to check in on my elderly aunt,
Oh
anymore
dear.
because, I know I can just talk to her once a week instead of,
Right.
every day because she's got the robot to talk to. And I
Right.
worry about people, thinking that. And because I do not think that these technologies, as powerful as they are really perfect substitutes for human interaction.
Jeremy used the term foundation models and explained it, but can you step back a little bit and tell me what's happening, what we really mean by foundation models, and how transferable they make these technologies from one area to another?
Yeah, so a foundation model is an AI model, usually based on a neural network, which is a type of AI loosely based on the human brain. And the idea is it's been trained on lots of data usually within a particular area. And as a result, the model that comes out of it can do lots of different tasks across that area, as opposed to just in the past, we had AI applications that could really only do one very narrow thing. They could often do that one very narrow thing much better than a person could. For instance, finding defects on an assembly
Mm.
line by looking at pictures. Let's say, they'd have a video camera and it would look at things coming down the assembly line. It turned out that years ago we were able to train what are called computer vision models that could pick out these defects much better than a person could, and that was great. But you could not ask the same model to identify something else in the picture, for instance. And you certainly couldn't ask it to do something like play chess. It wasn't designed to do that. Now we have these foundation models that, in some cases can do many tasks across an area, or in the case of these large language models that OpenAI has produced, or Anthropic, or Google DeepMind, in some ways they're completely general purpose tools. So they can do almost any task at a decent level, sort of straight out of the box. And that could include things like finding defects or, some other task like, talking to you about poetry. So that's, I think, the big difference. Now, I have to say that what we found is that these totally general purpose models, they're not universally good at all of those tasks. And actually, if what you care about is detecting defects on your assembly line, you probably still want a narrow model that's trained just for that. And there are also this whole class of sort of slightly more specific foundation models for just a particular area of work. So I mentioned the one about robotics before. So that, again, you could not really just take one of these models from OpenAI and apply it to a robot arm and think it would do very well. But what this company called Physical Intelligence done is trained foundation models just on the movements of robotic arms and on sorting tasks. And it turns out it can do any sorting task, and it can get that arm to move in kind of any way you would want it to, pretty much straight out of the box without all the specific training. And it can do that much better than a completely general purpose model. So any of these things that can do sort of more than one task straight out of the box after the initial training is generally referred to as a foundation model. And there are foundation models that are sprouting up in all different domains, and that's helping to lead to very rapid progress with AI. One of the areas in the book that I was most enthusiastic about is the impact potentially on drug discovery. And there are a number of foundation models now for predicting the shape of proteins based on DNA sequences, and then even other aspects of what a protein does. So like, how will the protein bind with another protein? Or what will a particular small molecule, how will that bind to a particular site on the protein? And being able to predict that with great accuracy, which is extremely important for drug discovery, we now have a number of companies developing models, foundation models, that will do this. And they will do sort of, again, in the past, you might have had to train a model that just did this one thing, like it would predict how well a particular chemical would bind with a set of proteins. Now you can essentially predict how any chemical will bind with any protein. And that's a big
Wow.
change.
Huge change, huge change. So the other phrase you mentioned a little bit earlier on was reasoning, and I'm putting that in quotes as I say it.
Yeah.
It's making me think of early philosophy courses and learning logic in a very sort of mathematical way, if you like. Where are we going with reasoning? How should we understand that term? Is there another term you'd rather use than reasoning? Um, what's happening there? Because that seems like a huge step towards we've been talking about earlier, which is artificial general intelligence.
Yes, so a number of companies have come out with models that they call reasoning models. What they tend to mean by that is just that the model uses this what's called a chain of thought, a step-by-step process, that it has its own kind of internal monologue. Some of the models make that monologue kind of clear to the user, some of them hide it from the user, but the model is thinking about, well, what steps should I take to accomplish the task that the user has asked me to accomplish? And then it goes and tries to take those steps. And the models have the ability to some extent when they encounter a problem to backtrack and try a different approach and resolve some of those issues. And because it's a step-by-step process, it's very good for, which we'll probably talk about in a minute, it has enabled what is called agentic AI, so AI that can actually perform tasks for us across the internet using other software. And that's been unlocked really by these reasoning models. Now, the reason we should be a little bit cautious about the word reasoning is because it's not very clear yet if these models really ponder things logically in the way a person would. In fact, there's a growing amount of evidence to suggest they do not. And maybe what they're doing is much more akin to having, in this vast amount of data they've been trained for, lots of possible steps to take. And they're essentially doing a kind of search process across those steps. And they're kind of going down a pathway, but they're not they seem to still fail very often when they encounter a completely novel problem or a problem. If it gets to a certain level of complexity, they tend to fail. And that, researchers are suggested is because they aren't really taking a kind of first principles, abstract logical principles, and applying them. They don't seem to have the ability to kind of manipulate symbols the way a person would, where you could take some fundamental first principles ideas about logic and apply it to almost any problem. They don't seem to be doing that. They still seem to be essentially kind of searching what they've already been trained on for something that looks close to the problem they've been asked to solve or the task they've been asked to do. And they start going down one of those pathways. And then if they counter a problem, they might say, okay, well, what else was in my training data that was kind of close to this? And let's see if we can switch over to that. So it's not quite what a person would do.
So I'm really curious. I can't resist asking. You may not know the answer to this, but what are these models teaching us about our own brains, about human neurology? I know we
Yeah,
went
so
with
yeah,
human language as well, but this
mm.
is a really interesting process, right? What do they teach us about us?
Yeah, so it's several interesting things. I mean, lots of neuroscientists are looking at this.
Right.
I think in terms of telling us a lot about how our own brains work, the answer may be not that much or not directly, because the wiring of these things is really not how the human brain works. And while they're sort of loosely based on a very abstracted schematic of how a neuron works, that's not really how the human brain works. And we know that the human brain, does not function in the way that these things do. On the other hand, it does tell us a little bit about language. So by doing this vast statistical mapping of language that they do, we've been able to find some interesting things. I think one of the interesting things recently is in trying to figure out how large language models think about, I should again put in quotes, how they, it's very hard to not anthropomorphize these things.
Oh, absolutely.
But one of the issues is sort of trying to figure out what's going on inside the black box of these models. People have started probing them for seeing which artificial neurons in these networks are most activated by certain inputs, and you can kind of map that out. And in the process of this mapping, they have realized, for instance, that the models that are trained across multiple languages actually form kind of conceptual clusters. So some neurons are activated across languages by words that are the same concept, which is interesting. So it would seem to imply that there is a kind of universal conceptual knowledge. They do not form completely separate pathways for different languages. It seems that they do, in their internal states, have some idea of concepts that seem kind of universal across languages, which is kind of interesting. It gets into some of the philosophy around, is there a universal grammar, which Noam Chomsky for years was trying to argue that there was. That's very controversial still within linguistics, but there's some evidence from the way these models make connections between and among languages to suggest that there are kind of these universal concepts, and that perhaps when humans think about language, we are forming similar things.
Let's get a little bit into the way you and I interact every day now with AI agents, the hype around them, what's really going on here, and what you think the future is of those relationships which we all engage in now, wittingly or not.
Yeah. So, I mean, the agents is sort of the big buzzword this year in AI. And there are lots of companies that have invested a lot of money in pushing businesses to adopt AI agents. Salesforce, which is a company that makes software for business, what's called customer relationship management software, they almost renamed the whole company Agentforce because they were so sure that this was going to be the future wave. I would say, what's happening is that lots of companies would like to use agents because they would like to. It's an easy way to kind of see the productivity gains from this technology, because it would potentially allow you to automate entire parts of workflows or entire tasks. So far, I would say the area where agents have had the most impact seems to be software development. So, you can use AI models to actually write whole sections of code, not just suggest so there were a number of things going back a couple of years now, things like GitHub Copilot, which was a system that could suggest sort of to a human programmer like how to complete a certain line of code. This goes well beyond that. You can just tell that I want an application that will do the following things. It will actually go out and write all of that code. It will perform the unit testing on that application. It can potentially debug the application. So lots and lots of tasks that it can do automatically. That is having a big impact in the world of software development. But I think one of the interesting things in software development that's different than maybe lots of other areas where we want to use agents is that the number of sort of right answers is limited. And if you have a wrong answer, the code often just doesn't work at all. It becomes very easy to sort of figure out that the code won't compile if it's really bad code. So, and that's not true in some other areas. So in some other areas, it's not always obvious what a really bad answer is. And therefore, it's a lot harder to provide feedback to the models. And I think what we've found with agents so far is that they're good at. We have agents that can probably do sort of what are called short-range tasks, those that don't have too many steps involved. But once you get into many steps, sort of beyond 5 steps, again, it's very hard to get these agents to perform reliably. And I think that's, again, frustrated a lot of people. And there's also a big debate about what an agent even means. So some people are using the word agent very loosely for anything that does something for you on the internet. But I think actually to be a true agent, you have to include some of that reasoning ability. You probably has to be a kind of multi-step process, not just a single step. And I think we're getting there. It's actually very exciting what's happening with agents, but the hype is running right now, I think, well ahead of the reality.
So talk to me a little bit more though, specifically about consumer AI agents.
Yeah, so lots of people would like to create a kind of a personal assistant agent for consumers. Bill Gates has said that this would be kind of the one app to rule them all, if this, in essence, because if this worked, you might never have to go to a website again. You might never, you could just tell your personal assistant to go out, AI to go out and do things for you. It would go to the web potentially and perform all these actions. So the classic example is it's already quite possible to get an AI model to suggest an itinerary for a vacation. But the next step, of course, would be to say, okay, well, that's great. I like that itinerary. Go out and book all of those flights, book those hotels, and make me the restaurant reservations at the places you suggested, and buy me the tickets to the museums. And that is the kind of vision a number of companies are working towards. There is a sense that people feel this will be a very impactful technology when we get there. And there are systems right now that can do a few of those steps, that can conduct some rudimentary transactions for you. Google DeepMind has debuted a system that can book you travel or restaurant reservations. They're still a little unreliable at the moment, I would say, and that's a bit of an issue because then you have this thing that's out there performing financial transactions for you, and there's a question of
Yeah.
what happens when it goes wrong, who's liable, and ultimately, the companies are saying, well, no, the user is still liable for the actions that the agent takes. And the agent, in some cases, there's a big active field of research about when the agent should come back to the user and say, oh, I'm thinking about taking the following step. Is that what you would like me to do? Of course, if the agent does that too often, it gets kind of annoying. The user might not like that. So there's this big debate about how often should the agent ask for clarification. And we'll sort of see what happens with that, going forward. It's going to be a very interesting area to watch.
One area I've been very struck by is when I do a little search, when I do my Google search for something, I'm coming up with now an AI response rather than, and I suspect people used to click on my articles in the past instead of finding the answers in the Google search. What's happening in that search area, and what impact is it having on institutions like yours and mine, which were information providers for people looking for answers?
Yeah, so it is true that so Google has increasingly rolled out what they call AI overviews, which are these little summaries generated by AI that appear above traditional search links. And then in the US, a month ago, they announced something called AI Mode, which is a much sort of deeper AI experience that is available to anybody who wants it in the US right now. Where it's not even just a summary with links under it. There are no links under it. You can ask these multiple follow-up questions. You can also even have the system do a few of these rudimentary agentic tasks, like asking it, okay, go ahead and book something for me on OpenTable or one of these restaurant reservation sites. So that is happening, and it's having a big impact. Seemingly on traffic to news organizations. Right. Because in the past, a lot of news organizations, a tremendous amount of their readership came from people asking questions on Google about what's happening in the news, and then those news sites would surface very high in the rank of links, and they would get a lot of people clicking through to read the articles. That is happening less now with this AI, with AI overviews, and certainly with AI mode. That Google is trying to say that, okay, but the people who do click the links engage more with the content. So they spend more time reading the article. They're very interested in it. They don't just bounce back out, which was more true with traditional Google search. I don't know. I think publishers are very worried about what this means to their business models. There's a real concern about how people are going to attract and retain readership in a world where you essentially have these kind of answer engines at your fingertips. And I think a lot of publications are realizing that they cannot depend on kind of Google search traffic. They really need this direct relationship with readers. They really need to try to make it a daily habit that people should go directly to the app or site of that publication. They should really encourage people to try to buy subscriptions. But I don't know. I think it's going to be difficult because I think it's just so easy to ask the AI assistant or the AI agent for a summary of all the news. And you could imagine things, something like Apple News, which again sends a lot of traffic currently to publishers. But you could imagine that kind of being the interface to that being a kind of AI agent, and it would just summarize articles from across different news organizations. Right. And then why would you only subscribe to the Washington Post or the New York Times if you could subscribe to this AI agent newsreader system that could access all of the world's newspapers? And why would you ever? And as long as you kind of trust that the information is being drawn from relatively high quality sources, I think to a lot of consumers of news, they might not care that it that information comes from the Washington Post or that information comes from the New York Times. They just want to know what's happening in the world, and this thing's going to tell them. So I think that all of these trends are very troubling, I think, for news organizations. I don't think anyone's really figured out, how to, what the business model is going to be going forward.
Yeah, constant churn in that area. You've also, we've talked about interacting, and of course, interaction has gone from just typing in messages to voice commands and other things. How is that changing, and what's the future there that you see? And I guess video as well. We're having a whole new way of interacting with our AI friends on our phones and laptops.
Yeah, so I do. So all of these models are becoming what's called multimodal, which means that they take inputs in lots of different forms, not just typing text. So you can talk to them. So it's taking in audio. You can show them pictures of things and ask them questions about those pictures. And in some cases, you can even show them live video and get them to talk to you about what's happening, what they're seeing, what you should do. They could walk you through potentially, let's say fixing a bicycle or something. You could show a live video of yourself trying to work the gears or whatever it is, and it could give you advice on, oh, you need this kind of wrench, and you need to turn it this way, and no, 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 you're doing it wrong. And you can imagine these kind of interactions coming, and they're coming very soon. And I think that does sort of change our relationship with AI. It's going to be something that's sort of constantly on, a kind of constant companion in the not too distant future. And that's actually why a lot of people are thinking that we may need some other kind of device, a hardware device to interact with these AI models. It's the reason big news a few weeks ago was that OpenAI was paying about $6.5 billion to acquire this startup by a guy named Johnny Ive, who's a very famous former Apple designer. He was the guy who basically designed the iPhone. And he and Sam Altman, the co-founder and CEO of OpenAI, had already kind of been working on this project to develop some kind of new hardware device that would not be a phone, that would be the interaction mechanism for people, an interface for people to interact with AI models. They've been very mysterious and haven't said very much about what this is. They've dropped a few hints that it's not a phone, they said it wasn't a pin that you would wear, though that's one idea people would have would be a pin. A lot of people actually think that these augmented reality glasses, like Meta has a partnership with Ray-Ban and produced glasses that have cameras sort of right there where the frames are. And I think a lot of people think that's not a bad idea for how this might work in the future, is that you would want something that can essentially kind of see what you're seeing and kind of always be on to ask questions so that you could ask questions about what you're seeing. You could imagine something that if you're at a cocktail party, it would automatically pull up like the LinkedIn profile of everybody you're looking at, and it could give you advice about what to say to them. This is kind of the future that we're very rapidly, I think, moving towards. Other people said no, not everyone wants to wear glasses, and maybe you want something that's something else that would be in your house, a little bit like an Amazon Echo, for instance, device or the Amazon Alexa device that you would speak to, a kind of smart speaker. There's lots of different ideas, but it's very clear that we are kind of probably going to move to these different kinds of hardware form factors.
Just jump back a little bit to the fixing bicycle idea. We already have YouTube University, if you like, where you can click on and look at your gears and figure it out. How would this be an advance on what we're already getting?
Yeah, I mean, well, some people would say it's not an advance. At least the YouTube,
Okay.
you can stop and pause or whatever, and it's easy, and you might trust that particular mechanic. Maybe you followed that person's videos for years on YouTube, and you know that they're good. That said, there are some advantages in that it can look at, it can actually, you can ask it questions at any time. You can ask it any question, which you certainly can't do with the YouTube video. The YouTube video is basically kind of one-way information channel. This becomes very much a dialogue, a two-way exchange of information, and it's much more personalized. It knows what you're actually working on at that moment. It might recognize that actually, you pulled up the video, like with the video, you have to find the. I'm sure we've all had this experience trying to fix something where we go to YouTube for advice, and it's like you have to find the thing that's actually the right model that you have in your house, and maybe for whatever reason the thing's been installed in your house in a way that looks different than it looks in the video, and you can't figure it out. Well, potentially this AI system overcomes all of those problems because it can look in real time exactly what you're looking at. It has this wide base of knowledge. It's been trained on every YouTube video in the world. It's been trained on every a manual for every piece of equipment that's ever been published on the internet. So, but it's been trained on lots of books about bicycle repair, if it's bicycle repair or plumbing or whatever it is, and therefore, potentially has access to a much greater knowledge base. But the problem, I think, is that issue of trust. I mean, you have to trust that it's correctly summarize this information, that it has actually found, the right system, that what it's telling you to do with your bicycle is not going to result in your tire falling off midway through your cycle ride and you being badly injured. So I think there are lots of issues about trust and reliability that we still haven't quite figured out how to work out. But the potential, of course, is very exciting.
Right. Another issue, open source models. What do we step back, tell us what we actually mean by that, what the pros and cons are. Give me a little context here, because it's another buzzword that's out there, and I think a lot of our audience would like to understand a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so this is another thing that's really happened in a big way in the last year since my book was published.
Mm.
So when ChatGPT came out, that's what's called a closed source model. OpenAI produces that model. You cannot download that model and run it on your own machine. You can only interact with that model through a interface on the internet, or your computer, or if you have a big business system, it can use what's called an API, an application protocol interface, that allows you to interact with the model. Essentially what that just does, though, is it sends your query to the model, it sends your prompt to the model, and you get your response back from the model, but you have no access to the model itself. You can't modify its code. You have no way of probing in some very deep technical way what's happening inside that model. And you pay basically based on what's called the token, the little piece of data, every little piece of data that you're feeding the model, and every little piece of data it's sending back to you, you're charged for. That's generally how those kind of models work, and that's how the models from OpenAI, from Anthropic, from Google DeepMind, that's the majority of those models, that's how they're made available. Then what happened is some people said, well, we don't like that. We want much more control. We want to be able to run the model ourselves on our own hardware, to potentially modify the actual workings of the model. And so there are these models out there. They're often called open source. There's a big debate about whether they should really be called open source in some cases, because some of them do have some restrictions in their licensing on what you can do with them. So some people prefer the term open weight model, which means you can take the weights of the neural network and download them. But the point is, these are models that you can download for usually. Again, some of them have some restrictions on commercial use, but a lot of them are completely free. You can download them for any purpose, run them on your own hardware. You can actually modify these model weights, the kind of what the inner workings, the tunable knobs of the neural network. You can adjust those as you wish. So it potentially gives you a lot more control. The fact that the model itself is free potentially makes it lower cost. Now, some of these open weight models are still quite large, so it can still be quite expensive to run them. You have to rent, hardware in the cloud on which to host the model, and that can get expensive. Some companies have found, I've talked to them, that there's a kind of false economy of the open weight models, that they think they're going to save money, but actually hosting them and running stuff on them still ends up being more expensive than the proprietary models. But anyway, there's a big debate about this because one of the problems with the open weight models is you can take these and you can strip out any guardrails that the model makers have put in place. If you have some technical knowledge, it becomes very easy to kind of tune this model to do anything. So you could tune the model to produce malware very easily, or you could get the model to help you, build a bomb. Things that the proprietary model makers have spent some effort, trying to prevent their models from helping people do. With the open weight models, even if the developers have initially done that work of trying to make sure the model doesn't make it particularly easy to do that, it's very easy for the person who's downloaded the model to change the model, to retrain it, or to just adjust the weights in a way where it suddenly starts enabling them to do this. So this has raised concerns about the governance of AI overall. There's people who are worried that open weight models are very unsafe and potentially bring bigger risks of malicious use with them. I think people don't really know what to do about that. And you have this competition right now between the proprietary model companies and a lot of these open weight model producers. The best known open weight producer so far has been Meta, which has released a whole family called Llama of these open weight models. But then we've seen, again in the last year, a lot of Chinese companies release open weight models, including in January, there was a company called DeepSeek, which is a Chinese startup that released a model called R1, which is one of these reasoning models. So it can take multi-steps, and it uses this kind of chain of thought process to reason about what it's going to do. That's an open weight model. Anybody can download that and use it for free. They also made it free to query on their own servers, which are located in China. They made it free to ask questions and get responses from it for people. And the other thing about that model is that DeepSeek had claimed it was very cheap to train, and there's some debate about that. Maybe we'll talk about that in a minute. But that also kind of woke people up. But there's generally this competition going on between those who feel like the future is mostly open weight models and those who feel like it's mostly proprietary models. I think if you talk to a lot of people at bigger companies about this, they're using both. And they really see the future as not being in one camp or the other. They see that there's maybe a role for both. Although a lot of technologists within the bigger companies, they like the open weight models because they like the controllability it gives them, and they feel like that's a big advantage of the open weight models.
So, Jeremy, I feel as if I'm just beginning to scratch the surface, but we have lots of readers or watchers who are dying to ask questions. So let me read a couple of them to you. And the first one comes very nicely out of the discussion we've just been having. And this speaker says, much of the public discourse around AI is framed as progress, but who is actually benefiting from this progress? Are we democratizing intelligence or just consolidating power in the hands of a few tech giants?
That's a great question.
It is a great question.
It is a great question. It's definitely true that there is a great consolidation of power that's happened so far with this technology. If you look at, who is producing this technology, it is just a handful of companies, the vast majority of them in two countries, in the U.S. and China, and the rest of the world is kind of left out of this discussion for the most part. And also, yeah, a lot of the money is flowing to just a handful of companies in those two countries. There's this feeling that this is going to be potentially hugely democratizing, and I can see scenarios in which it is really democratizing. I think it has given people access to knowledge that they wouldn't have before. And I know a couple of examples of people who've started companies where they've are essentially kind of one-person companies that deliver a kind of software product in a particular niche. And these are people who they had maybe a little bit of coding experience, but they weren't so technical that they could have done that without hiring a big team before. Now they're able to do it just themselves. And I've heard of other examples of small businesses that couldn't really afford to fight a legal case or to even explore like what the legal issues were because they couldn't afford the time of a lawyer. Through conversation with ChatGPT, not that it's a substitute for actually having a lawyer, but it at least enables them to get to the point where they get a sense of, okay, yeah, I think I have a case here, I should hire a lawyer, or actually, I don't think I have a leg to stand on here, I better do something else. So I think that there's a kind of democratization of knowledge that's happening here. I think there is a big question about it. Do those little benefits I've just talked about outweigh the fact that a tremendous amount of power and money is accruing to this small handful of companies on the West Coast of the US? Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think that there's a really active debate about that. I think a lot of people would say, why do we need this? Like the internet already had all this information on it. If you knew how to search well and you had enough time to read, you probably had access to this information before, and it was largely free to the consumer. Now, it wasn't really free because, of course, we were being shown ads by Google and all the rest, and they were gathering information about, what we were reading. So we were giving away something. But to a lot of people, that maybe felt like a better exchange than what's happening right now.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody who was serving on a board and didn't understand, was never able to participate in the financial discussions, now uses ChatGPT and says he sounds like a genius when he sits there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this, yeah, absolutely. I think there's this democratization it's just so much easier even than Google was. And because you can get it to explain it to you in terms you're going to understand, and you can ask follow-up questions, and it is actually, using this technology to access information, provided the information is accurate, is actually more powerful. But there is this big question about hallucinations, which is what they call it when AI models produce inaccurate information. That is a big concern. There is a concern that actually the reliability of systems is not yet to the level where it would really need to be for us to see the true benefits of the technology.
So let's take another audience question. This one is, you've reported on the rise of AI agents. Are we truly prepared for a scenario where these systems start making decisions that actively ignore or override human input?
I think we are not ready for that, but we need to start thinking very hard about this. And I think a lot of people had dismissed that idea as science fiction, including there are a number of computer scientists who were sort of dismissive of this idea. But I think there's growing evidence that we really should be concerned about this. Anytime these more capable models, particularly these reasoning models, have been tested, and the companies, to their credit, do a fair bit of testing prior to the release of the models, and they publish some interesting information about the testing they've done. These tests showed that the models are very capable of deception, that they will often lie
That word
about.
deception again,
Yeah,
it's
well,
like
again, a deception is a sort of
all
intent. Well, what I'll say is that they take steps and then they do not accurately report the steps that they have taken. And they
Okay.
will often engage in behavior that will make it seem to the user like they've done something when they have not, or they will do something and then tell the user they haven't done it. So those things are worrying. Again, I think it speaks to it's a certain kind of unreliability. I think we need to really be careful about this. And I think one of the things I say over and over again in the book is I do think we need some kind of sensible regulation around this technology. And one of the things you might want to regulate, and you could do it within the context of existing kind of product liability law, but you would want to say to companies that, look, if you release these systems, you need to provide a reasonable guarantee that they are controllable, that they will not perform actions that the user did not specify, and they will not, and that they will accurately report the actions that they've taken, and that's transparent to the user.
Okay, regulation, it's very different in the United States from Europe, China. How do you see that working if we were to introduce some sort of regulation in these, across borders and in different places?
Yeah, well, I think the cross-border question is particularly difficult, but I do think on some of the really big questions about AI governance, we ought to be able to have some agreement. I think every country ought to see it, probably not in their interest, that you have companies developing uncontrollable AI systems that you give sort of unlimited access to tools to. I don't think that's probably in any country's interest. So I think that there is room for maybe some baseline agreement on, okay, well, any company building these systems anywhere should submit them to certain tests. And you could even, I know it gets tricky because this is dual use technology. People see this technology as having military applications, and there's this very active debate in the US where people are saying, oh, we can't impose regulation on companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and Google because if we do that, China will beat us to these military applications of this technology. I don't know. I think there would be ways around that. I think you could even, as a start, say, okay, we're only going to talk about civilian uses of this technology, and we'll exempt the military uses. Of course, I'm not sure as humanity we really want to do that, because actually some of the scariest stuff you could do with this technology is put it inside military applications and give it control over weapons, or have it giving advice to humans on when to deploy weapons. I mean, I think we need to think very hard about that. But as a start, you could I think see countries agreeing that for civilian uses you want certain baseline testing to be done on any application. And that can be done within each country's potentially national laws, but you would want some agreement that countries will pass laws that will meet certain standards. That's one way it could work. You do see different approaches in different places. The U.S. hasn't really done anything in terms of AI regulation, and so a lot of states have proposed regulation. And now you have actually right now there's a bill in Congress as part of Trump's big beautiful spending bill. There's a provision in there that would actually impose a moratorium on all of the states from enacting any AI legislation of their own for 10 years. It's not clear that that's constitutional, but that's in there. And if that there's some debate about whether that's going to get stripped out of the bill. But if it passes, then I guess the U.S. Won't have any state level regulation for 10 years, and in the current administration and with the current Congress, there seems little appetite to pass federal regulation.
Right.
I don't know. Some people I talk to think that it will take a disaster. I mean, as something like the last question, where you have AI systems that escape control and maybe hopefully don't kill all of us, but maybe cause some financial damage before people wake up and realize that we need to do something.
Let's go to another audience question. Okay. Agents go to the web to get either info or to book services, but if the web pages will be consumed by agents, how would the advertising business be affected? Sorry, I'm translating a little bit from
Yeah.
Spanish here. Um, wouldn't the agents reduce the creation of webs, and then there's to be no new feed for the knowledge? So I may not have.
Yeah.
I guess this is about
Yeah.
advertising. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So it's a great question actually, because a lot of people don't really know. Brands, I think, are desperate right now to figure out, well, how do I have my brand appear more prominently in the response of a chatbot to a particular
Right.
query? And there's a number of marketing firms out there who claim they've figured some of this out. There's a whole field rapidly developing called, it used to be called search engine optimization, SEO. This is called,
Right.
it's basically GEO, generative AI, optimization, or generative engine optimization. And but I don't think we know yet how that's going to work. There is some talk about, well, maybe we would have advertising, display advertising appear alongside chatbot responses. Um, Perplexity, which is one of these AI search companies, has talked about maybe we would do that. They haven't done it yet, haven't implemented it. Google has talked about maybe we would do that, but hasn't implemented it yet. My concern is that there might be arrangements with the AI vendors that they would accept money from brands to have the brand appear more prominently in response, and that would not be transparent to the user. So, I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book, I think, is that if one of the regulations I'd like to see is that if there are those arrangements that are made, that they always be transparent to the user, so that you would know, okay, well, the chatbot is telling me I should buy Nike shoes, but that's because Nike paid OpenAI a lot of money to have it tell me that.
We're getting close to the end of our time, but there are two things I really want to ask you before we go. One is about energy, a huge global issue right now, and we know that AI is an enormous consumer. And the other is something that takes us back to the mission of this own foundation, and that's, what do you think the impact could be on Spain or Southern Europe from the trends you're witnessing? So, as I said, we've got a couple of minutes left, but if you could take just a shot at those two things, I think they're a good way of rounding up our great conversation. And I
Yeah,
wish
so
it longer.
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. Energy, so both big topics. We could spend a long time
Yeah,
talking about both. Energy, yes, as I mentioned at the start, a huge issue right now, because I think everyone's realizing we're going to have to build more data centers, even if, there's some debate about how big the models have to be to have certain capabilities. And there was some sense going, maybe a year and a half ago or a year ago, that we would have to keep building bigger and bigger models, and they would need bigger and bigger centralized data centers to do that. I think one of the things that's happened with DeepSeek from China, one of the things about it, as I mentioned, is that it was trained for a lot less money, and it's actually a fairly small model, yet fairly capable. I think that's shown people, well, maybe we don't have to build such
hmm,
massive data centers, or we don't have to
right,
think about continually expanding the size of them to get the capabilities we want. Now, that said, because AI is being infused into everything, training is one thing, but then there's actually the running of the trained models, which is called inference. So even if the training essentially scale doesn't keep going up, it's very likely that inference is going to keep exploding. And you are going to need at least many, many more small data centers sort of everywhere in order to run that
wow,
inference. And that will drive energy demands. So I think,
right,
people are talking about nuclear as a solution.
right,
People have restarted nuclear plants. 3 Mile Island in the US, which had been
yeah,
mothballed, they restarted one of the
yeah,
reactors there just to serve Microsoft. People are talking about small nuclear reactors that might be co-located with the data centers. People are also talking about putting data centers in places with a lot of solar energy, a lot of wind energy, which Southern Europe has quite a lot of. I think there are other issues with data centers. They tend to also use a lot of water right now for cooling.
right,
And of course, places with a lot of solar energy often are very water stressed as well. And so that's an issue. And
yeah,
I'm sure an issue in Spain and Southern Europe. So yeah, I think this is a very active area of debate. I think we're going to have to make some decisions about, what are the national priorities here, and how much.
right,
Right now, I think the AI companies have been really pressuring governments to say, oh, you have to do this or you're going to be left behind. I think governments need to take a step back and say, okay, but at what cost? And the environmental cost has to be factored in there. And I think citizens need to kind of wake up to the idea that and not just be kind of railroaded by the tech companies. In terms of what this
one
could,
minute
yeah,
left. So
Southern Europe,
winding up,
Southern Europe. Well, I mean, I think look, Southern Europe has lots of businesses that could potentially use AI for in ways that are transformative, just like everywhere else. And I think Southern Europe in particular has had some issues around labor shortages and an aging demographic population. And I think there are lots of ways in which AI can help upskill people, bring young people into the labor force. Potentially automate some roles in some areas where there just aren't enough people currently.
Right.
So that could be a big impact. And then I think if you talk about embodied AI, there are potentially lots of uses in agriculture, which is still very important in Southern Europe.
Cute.
Although those I think are still a little further away. We may not see, robots replacing sort of people actually working on farms, picking things quite yet. But I think within a 10-year time frame, you could certainly think about that happening.
Jeremy Kahn, thank you so much for joining us today on this Bank Inter Foundation webinar. It's been enormously informative, and I really enjoyed the conversation. And I know our audience did too, because we've been continuing to get lots of questions.
Thank you so much.